At 80 years old, Walter Hale sat in a county courtroom and listened to his only son explain why he should no longer be trusted with a house key, a bank card, or the right to decide where he and his wife would live. Daniel called it protection. He mentioned a missed appointment, a scorched saucepan, and the afternoon Walter forgot where he had parked. Before lunch, the judge granted Daniel temporary control of his parents' finances. By sunset, their home was listed for sale, the locks had been changed, and 46 years of marriage had been reduced to 6 cardboard boxes. But Daniel had missed one account. $14,300 remained in a savings book Walter had opened decades earlier, outside the family trust. He used nearly all of it to buy the abandoned Black Ridge cargo cable station, a rusting structure where 3 workers had died 31 years before. People said the purchase proved Daniel was right. They laughed when Walter climbed the mountain with his old tools. They whispered that a man who misplaced his glasses had no business touching machinery that had once killed people. Then Walter opened a brake drum sealed since the night of the accident. Beneath grease and corrosion, he found a replacement part stamped with a serial number that did not belong there. That number would reopen 3 deaths, threaten a respected family, and force Daniel to face a truth the whole town had spent 31 years trying to bury. If you believe growing older should never mean surrendering the right to choose your own life, stay with Walter and Evelyn. Their story is about more than an abandoned station or a hidden piece of machinery. It is about dignity, memory, and what happens when the people who claim to protect us begin deciding that our voice no longer matters. Long before anyone questioned Walter Hale's judgment, people called him when machinery made sounds no one else could explain. For 42 years, he inspected cable systems that carried stone, timber, and equipment across the mountains north of Bell County. He had worked in sleet that froze to his eyelashes, in summer heat that softened grease inside metal housings, and on narrow maintenance platforms above deep ravines. Walter was never the loudest person on a crew. He was the one who listened, a bearing that rasped instead of hummed, a cable that shivered under an uneven load, a brake shoe wearing faster on one side. Those details mattered because lives depended on them. He kept black notebooks filled with measurements, dates, weather conditions, and sketches of parts drawn from memory. Even after retirement, he stored them by year in a cabinet beside the furnace. Evelyn understood records differently. For nearly 3 decades, she worked in the administrative office of Ridgway Stone and Freight, tracking shipments, repair orders, supplier codes, and employee files. She could look at a document number and tell which department created it and whether it belonged in the folder where it had been placed. Their skills had built a quiet marriage. Walter noticed when the water pump sounded wrong. Evelyn noticed when household bills stopped matching bank statements. He repaired what could fail without warning. She preserved what people might later deny. They had lived in the same white 2-story house for 46 years. Walter replaced the porch beams after a winter storm. Evelyn planted lilacs along the fence. Marks from Daniel's childhood remained in the kitchen doorway, each labeled with a date in her handwriting. Daniel had been the center of nearly every decision they made. When he was 9, a heart infection kept him out of school for months. Walter refused a promotion that required travel so he could be home during the day. Years later, Evelyn withdrew part of her retirement savings to help Daniel finish college without debt. When he started Hale Ridge construction, they signed against their house so he could purchase his first excavator. For a long time, Daniel seemed grateful. He brought groceries during snowstorms. He fixed their phones when updates confused them. He drove Evelyn to appointments when Walter's knees made long hospital corridors difficult. His concern arrived gradually, wrapped in sensible language. The first time he suggested selling the house, he called it planning ahead. The second time, he brought brochures for a senior community with polished floors, scheduled meals, and a small artificial pond. He spoke about safety, convenience, and how relieved everyone would feel if they no longer had stairs. Walter said they would consider changes when they needed them. Daniel answered that people their age were often the last to recognize when that time had come. Walter was aging. He sometimes entered a room and forgot what he meant to retrieve. Once, he placed his glasses in the refrigerator beside a jar of mustard. After a crowded medical appointment, he walked through the wrong row of the parking lot and spent several minutes looking for their truck. But that winter, he also heard a faint knock in the furnace and shut it down before a cracked fan mount damaged the motor. He calculated the replacement dimensions without a manual. When the technician arrived, Walter's measurements were exact. Evelyn noticed Daniel never mentioned such moments. He collected only the mistakes. He began asking where they kept the deed, whether their wills were current, and which accounts required both signatures. He offered to simplify their finances by moving everything into one family trust. Evelyn let him review the utility bills, but refused to combine the accounts. Afterward, Daniel became more attentive and less affectionate. He arrived with folders instead of pie. He photographed labels on medicine bottles. He asked Walter the same question twice, watching whether the answer changed. Once, while Walter searched for a misplaced wrench, Daniel quietly recorded him on his phone. Evelyn saw the red light reflected in the microwave door. She did not confront him. She wanted to believe he was frightened, not calculating. She told herself children sometimes mistook control for love when their parents grew old. A week later, Daniel scheduled what he called a routine wellness appointment. He chose the doctor. He offered to drive. Before leaving that morning, he asked Walter to bring identification, insurance papers, and a list of every account they owned. That was when Evelyn understood the appointment was not only about health, it was about authority. The appointment began with a clipboard and a locked door. Daniel had arranged for Walter to be seen by Dr. Miriam Cole, a physician whose office specialized in aging transitions. Walter expected questions about his knees, blood pressure, and medication. Instead, Dr. Cole asked him to name the date, repeat 5 words, draw a clock, and explain what he would do if he smelled smoke in the house. He answered most questions correctly. He misplaced one word and drew the minute hand slightly too long. Dr. Cole noted mild memory changes, recommended a fuller evaluation, and said nothing about incapacity. Daniel asked whether his father should still be making major financial decisions. The doctor replied that one brief visit could not answer that. Evelyn watched Daniel write something down. 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived from the county court. Daniel had filed for temporary control of their finances and requested emergency authority to arrange safer housing. Attached were photographs of the scorched saucepan, a list of missed appointments, and still images from the video Daniel made while Walter searched for the wrench. There was also a statement describing his parents as increasingly confused, resistant to help, and vulnerable to exploitation. Walter read that sentence twice. "I taught him to sign his name," he said. "Now he's using it to say I don't know mine." Evelyn opened a legal pad and listed every claim that was misleading, incomplete, or false. They hired a local attorney, but Daniel had already requested that their checking account be temporarily frozen. At the emergency hearing, his lawyer spoke in the patient tone of someone explaining a necessary inconvenience. No one accused Walter of being fully incapable. They only had to persuade the judge that delay might put the couple's property at risk. Daniel described the stairs, Walter's balance, Evelyn's arthritis, and the possibility of unpaid bills. He said he was not seeking ownership. He was seeking time to protect them while professionals completed an assessment. Walter wanted to interrupt when Daniel mentioned love. Evelyn pressed 2 fingers against his wrist beneath the table. Their attorney argued that mild forgetfulness was not incompetence. She pointed out that Evelyn still managed the household records and Walter could explain each account, expense, and insurance policy. But emergency hearings rewarded urgency more than nuance. The judge granted Daniel temporary authority over existing financial accounts for 30 days. He was ordered to preserve the property and make no permanent sale without further approval. Daniel thanked the court as if he had received permission to help. By the next morning, a real estate agent had photographed the house. The listing was marked, "Coming soon, not sold," but Evelyn understood the message. Daniel intended to create momentum before anyone could stop him. He also began removing furniture. The dining table was loaded into a truck because, he said, the senior residents would not have space for it. A cedar chest containing Evelyn's quilts disappeared into storage. Walter found colored stickers on bookshelves, lamps, and cabinets. "Inventory," Daniel explained. He had already reserved a 2-room unit at Meadowview Senior Living. He showed them pictures of wide hallways and smiling residents eating soup beneath fluorescent lights. "We're not moving there," Evelyn said. Daniel's expression hardened briefly before concern returned. "You don't have to decide today." "You already decided," Walter said. The final break came after a follow-up appointment Daniel insisted they attend. Ruth Calder drove them home because Daniel claimed he had a meeting. Walter inserted his key into the front lock, but it stopped halfway. He tried Evelyn's key, then the back door. Neither worked. A new keypad had been installed beside the garage. Daniel answered on the fourth call. He said the locks had been changed because contractors needed controlled access while the house was being evaluated. He promised to let them in after his meeting. Walter looked through the front window at the hallway he had paneled by hand. A lamp burned in the living room, though no one had been home when they left. "What contractors?" Evelyn asked. Daniel paused, then said a cleanup crew had come to remove hazards. Ruth cursed. Daniel ended the call. They waited 27 minutes in the cold before a young man from the cleanup company opened the door. He had been told the owners were moving permanently and their son held legal authority. Inside, boxes lined the walls. The framed photograph from Walter and Evelyn's 40th anniversary lay face down on the floor. Evelyn turned it upright, wiped the glass, and placed it in the first box she claimed. Daniel arrived, carrying a folder. He said Meadowview could accept them that evening. Walter asked whether Daniel's construction company was in trouble. The question changed the room. Daniel said business had slowed, material costs had risen, and everyone had financial pressures. Then he accused Walter of changing the subject because he could not accept reality. Evelyn asked why the house had been photographed before the court authorized a sale. Daniel said he was exploring options. She asked why furniture had been removed. He said he was reducing risk. Every answer sounded reasonable until placed beside the next one. Walter did not shout. He went to the basement, opened the steel cabinet by the furnace, and removed his inspection notebooks, a brass tension gauge, and the wooden toolbox Daniel had once given him for Father's Day. Evelyn packed clothes, medication, legal papers, family photographs, and the household ledger she had maintained since 1978. 6 boxes filled the bed of Ruth's truck. Daniel followed them onto the porch. "You're proving my point," he said. "Walking away like this is reckless." "No," Evelyn replied. "Changing our locks was reckless. We are choosing what happens next." They spent that night in the narrow room behind Ruth's hardware store. Walter slept badly. Evelyn did not sleep. Near dawn, she opened the household ledger and checked every account Daniel had listed in the court filing. Most were frozen. One was missing. It was a passbook savings account Walter had opened before Daniel was born, funded by overtime pay from winter inspections. They had nearly forgotten it because no statements had been mailed for years. The account was in Walter's name alone, had never entered the family trust, and sat outside the temporary orders list of controlled assets. The balance was $14,312. It was not enough for another house. It was barely enough for several months of rent, food, legal fees, and medical costs. Evelyn turned to the final page of the court order. Daniel's authority covered the property and accounts identified on the filing date. It did not grant control over a new asset purchased afterward with money outside those accounts. "We can fight him from here," Walter said. Evelyn closed the ledger. "Or we can make sure that when we fight, we are standing somewhere he cannot lock us out of." On Ruth's desk lay the county's weekly list of abandoned properties. Halfway down the second page was a name Walter had not heard in years. Black Ridge Cargo Station. Ruth gave Walter and Evelyn the room behind her hardware store for 3 nights without asking for rent. It was barely wide enough for the fold-out bed, a metal chair, and the 6 boxes they had carried from the house. A small window faced the alley, where delivery trucks arrived before dawn. Evelyn arranged their medicines on the sill and placed the anniversary photograph beside them. Walter set his wooden toolbox beneath the chair. Neither of them said the room was temporary. The county property list remained on Ruth's desk. Black Ridge Cargo Station had been abandoned for nearly 3 decades. The listing described a lower service building, an upper machinery room, an old worker's bunkhouse, and 9 acres of steep land. The structures were sold as is. No utilities were guaranteed. Access was seasonal. The county accepted no responsibility for unstable equipment, rockfall, or remaining cable tension. The price was $13,800. Ruth read the figure twice. "That leaves you $500 in change," she said, "before food, fuel, repairs, or a lawyer." Walter studied the photograph attached to the listing. The station sat on a ledge above a pine-covered ravine. Part of the roof had collapsed over the loading bay, but the stone foundation remained straight. "What are you seeing?" Evelyn asked. "Someone built the lower walls to last." Ruth folded her arms. "That is not the same as saying 2 people can live there." "No," Walter said. "It isn't. That answer reassured Evelyn more than a promise would have. Walter remembered Black Ridge from his working years. The station had carried cut granite from a quarry on the northern slope to railcars in the valley. After the accident, the company blamed an overloaded carrier and closed the route before an independent inspection could be completed. Walter had not been assigned to the investigation. His supervisor told him the company had its own engineers. At the time, Walter accepted that boundary, though one detail stayed with him. The report said the primary brake failed under excess weight, yet photographs showed the cable had stopped less than 40 feet after the carrier broke free. A complete failure should have sent it much farther down the line. Something else had caught the load. The next morning, Ruth drove them to the county office. Evelyn requested the complete disposal packet before they signed anything. It included structural warnings, an environmental notice, and an old survey. Near the back, she found a faded Ridgeway stone and freight code stamped beneath the county transfer number. This format came from Central Records, she said. Equipment sites started with a location number. Black Ridge was 14. The code did not prove anything, but it confirmed that company records had once been attached to the property. The packet said those records had been removed before the county took possession. They signed nothing that day. Instead, they borrowed Ruth's four-wheel drive truck and followed a narrow mountain road toward Black Ridge. Rain had softened the shoulders, and weeds scraped both doors. The station appeared through the fog without warning. Its upper tower rose above the trees, like the frame of a building stripped to its bones. A broken loading platform hung over the ravine. The cable itself had been cut years earlier, but a dark length still stretched from the machinery house toward the first support tower before disappearing into the mist. Evelyn expected Walter to hurry toward it. He did not. He walked the perimeter first, marked loose stone with orange ribbon, and tested porch boards before placing his weight on them. At the doorway, he stopped Evelyn until he had checked the ceiling joists. The lower building smelled of wet wood, grease, and animals. Window glass covered one corner of the floor. Rain had stained the former office, but the floor remained level. Walter examined the foundation bolts and found only surface rust. The workers' bunkhouse was worse. One wall had bowed outward. He tied the door shut and marked it unsafe. The upper machinery room stood behind a steel door at the far end of the station. A county padlock hung from a newer chain, but beneath it remained an older metal seal pressed with the number 14. Evelyn recognized the shape. That seal came from Ridgeway's internal audit office. Walter crouched without touching it. The hinges were corroded, yet the doorframe showed fewer water stains than the surrounding wall. Someone had protected this entrance after the rest of the station was abandoned. A gust moved through the ravine. The remaining cable tightened with a low hum. Walter raised one hand. From beyond the steel door came a dull metallic knock, followed by a faint scrape. "Loose plate?" Ruth asked. "Maybe. You don't sound convinced." "I'm not convinced of anything yet." The lower office could be made weatherproof. A spring-fed storage tank uphill still held water. The roof above 2 rooms remained sound. The access road required work, but it was passable. It was not a home. It was, however, a place no one else had the right to choose for them. On the drive down, Evelyn asked, "Are we buying it because it can shelter us, or because you think the accident report was wrong?" "Both reasons would be dangerous," Walter said. "So we only buy it if the building can be made safe, the deed is clean, and finding nothing would still leave us with a place of our own. Then we keep enough money for food and legal filings." Walter nodded. "We negotiate." The county accepted $12,900 because no other bidder had visited the property. Ruth covered the recording fee as a loan, and Evelyn wrote a repayment schedule before taking the money. They signed the deed 2 days later. Daniel called that evening. At first, he sounded stunned. Then his voice rose. He demanded the parcel number, asked whether they had signed an easement, and wanted to know exactly how much land came with the station. He did not ask whether there was heat, whether the roof leaked, or where they would sleep. Evelyn wrote each question down. Daniel said the purchase was reckless and threatened to return to court. Walter told him the money sat outside the temporary order and the deed had been recorded legally. "You don't understand what you bought," Daniel said. "Then explain it." Daniel went quiet. In the pause, Evelyn heard papers move near his phone and another man speak too softly to understand. Daniel ended the call without answering. The next morning, Ruth brought them a county planning map. A red dotted line crossed the northern edge of Black Ridge and continued toward land recently acquired by Voss Development. It was labeled Proposed Resort Service Access. Walter placed the deed beside the map. For the first time, the station's low price looked less like neglect, and Daniel's anger looked less like concern. The first night at Black Ridge began before sunset, because Walter refused to learn the building in darkness. He and Evelyn carried in only what they needed: blankets, food, medicine, 2 lanterns, a kerosene heater, bottled water, Walter's tools, and the household ledger. Everything else stayed covered in Ruth's truck. Walter marked the lower station with chalk. White meant safe enough for ordinary use. Yellow meant enter only with him. Red meant stay out. The former dispatch office received the first white mark. Its ceiling joists were dry, the floor sat level, and one window still closed against the wind. Evelyn swept out mouse droppings, washed the desk with rainwater, and hung a wool blanket over the cracked glass. She placed their anniversary photograph on a shelf made from an old signal board. The adjoining break room became their sleeping space. Walter found a split seam in the stovepipe and sealed it with furnace cement. Until it cured, they relied on the kerosene heater and kept a window open slightly for ventilation. By late afternoon, rain struck the roof in bursts. The spring tank uphill still fed a rusted pipe into the station, but Walter would not trust the water. He flushed the line, rigged a gravity filter, and let Evelyn boil the result. "This is not how I pictured retirement," she said, filling 2 enamel cups. Walter was clearing pine needles from a drain. "I never pictured retirement. That was always the problem." He looked up. Evelyn handed him a cup. They ate canned soup at the old dispatch desk while wind pressed against the walls. Outside, the cut cable disappeared into fog. The first sound came shortly after 8. A low vibration passed through the steel frame overhead. Dust slipped from a beam. Walter stopped with his spoon halfway to his mouth. The vibration faded. "Wind?" Evelyn asked. "Wind on the line." At 9:30, it returned, followed by a metallic impact from the upper level. Walter took a lantern and his inspection notebook. Evelyn blocked the doorway. "You marked that stair yellow." "I'm only going to the landing. That is still beyond white." He almost argued. Then he tied one end of a rope around his waist and secured the other to a column. Evelyn examined the knot. Too much slack. Walter adjusted it. They climbed together as far as the first landing. Several stair bolts had loosened where water entered through the wall, so Walter tested each tread with a pry bar. At the top stood the sealed machinery room door. The newer county chain hung loose, yet the older audit seal remained fixed beneath it. Walter raised the lantern. A narrow band of clean metal showed where the entrance had once been shielded by something wider than the current chain. He wrote down the observation. A gust entered the ravine. The remnant of cable tightened outside, drawing a groan through the tower. Then came 3 distinct blows. Clang. A pause. Clang. Another pause. Clang. Evelyn counted the intervals. They were nearly identical. "That is not a loose panel," she said. "No." Walter placed his fingertips against the wall. The vibration came from below the height of the main shaft. Could something still be turning? Not continuously, but something still has movement. Fine rust covered the threshold except along one narrow arc, where repeated vibration had shifted the dust. Walter did not touch the seal. Back downstairs, he drew the station's likely mechanical layout. The main cable had been cut beyond the first tower, but a remaining section still ran from the drum through the upper guide assembly. If it had snagged beneath rock or timber in the ravine, wind could pull against it. The station was not operating. It was still carrying load. "We sleep in the truck," Evelyn said. Walter considered the outer support frame above, where they had parked. "The office is safer if the anchor holds. If it does not, then we leave before the weather worsens." He marked the hall toward the tower base red and blocked it with 2 wooden stakes. They slept in their coats. Near midnight, rain became sleet. Walter woke several times, listening from habit rather than panic. At 2:17, the 3 blows came again. Evelyn checked her watch and wrote the time in the household ledger. "You have your records," she whispered. "I have mine." At dawn, frost covered the loading rails. Walter followed the remaining cable from a safe distance. Through binoculars, he saw it dip into a stand of pines below the ridge. One tree leaned at an unnatural angle. The cable had wrapped around its trunk. Each gust bent the tree downhill, pulling the line tight. When the wind eased, the tree sprang back and released part of the load. That movement traveled uphill into the station. Walter calculated the force twice. It was not enough to turn the main drum fully, but it could shift damaged parts inside the housing. Before approaching the machinery room, he needed to reduce the tension. He and Evelyn spent the morning clearing drainage, patching the office window with plastic, and raising their bedding on dry pallets. Each repair answered a specific risk: moisture, cold, contamination, or unstable access. By noon, Ruth arrived with bread, a battery radio, and a small generator. She looked at the chalk marks and rope barriers. "You have made this place look like a crime scene." "Good," Walter said. "People behave more carefully at crime scenes." Ruth said the town was already talking. Someone had posted a photograph of Walter entering Black Ridge. Comments called the purchase reckless and proof that Daniel had been right. Evelyn folded the printed page and slid it beneath a wobbling table leg. "No point wasting paper." Walter asked Ruth for rated cable clamps, a hand winch, 2 chains, and timber for a temporary brace. "You planning to open that room?" Ruth asked. "Not until the load is transferred." "And if you cannot transfer it?" "Then the door stays closed." By late afternoon, Walter had built a temporary restraint outside the machinery house. He anchored the remaining line to sound structural steel, took up only enough tension to stop the internal movement, and left the main assembly untouched. Evelyn copied his measurements and photographed every connection. As daylight faded, Walter tightened the hand winch 1 measured turn at a time. The leaning pine stopped swaying. Inside, the groan diminished. Walter reminded Evelyn that the restraint was temporary, not permission to trust the machinery. They waited through 3 gusts. No impact came from behind the door. Then something struck once from inside the sealed brake housing, not 3 times. Once, a small object rolled across metal and settled. Evelyn looked at the audit seal. What was moving in there? Walter opened his notebook and recorded the time. "I don't know yet." Beneath the date, he added 1 sentence. "Do not break seal until remaining load is independently secured." By sunrise, the wind had weakened enough for Walter to begin the next stage. He did not touch the machinery room seal. Instead, he checked every clamp installed the previous day and measured the remaining pull at 3 points. The temporary restraint had held, but the leaning pine still carried part of the cable's weight. Until that load was transferred to a stable anchor, opening the brake housing would be guesswork disguised as confidence. Evelyn recorded each reading in a fresh notebook, adding the time, temperature, and wind direction. At 9, a faded utility truck appeared on the mountain road. The driver parked below the marked boundary and waited. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with a canvas jacket, a week's growth of beard, and a climbing helmet on the passenger seat. He introduced himself as Eli Vance. "I saw the photograph online," he said. "Then I saw the cable in the background." Walter asked what he had noticed, that the line was still under tension. It was the first useful thing anyone outside the station had said about the photograph. Eli had spent 12 years maintaining radio towers, ski lift supports, and industrial access lines. He lost his position after a company merger. Since then, temporary jobs had come and gone. His truck held more of his life than he intended them to see. "You came to warn us?" Evelyn asked. "I came to make sure you knew what was above your roof." Walter handed him the binoculars and then the load calculations rather than offering a conclusion. Eli checked the figures twice. He questioned the estimated angle at the pine and suggested a lower value for the wet bark. Walter revised the calculation. The result changed, but not the decision. They needed a second anchor and a controlled release. Walter appreciated that Eli disagreed with a number before agreeing with the plan. Together, they installed a rated chain around a steel support embedded in the station's foundation. Eli climbed only after inspecting Walter's rope, and Walter refused to let him use the upper platform until both men tested its bolts. Evelyn stayed at the base, tracking every tool that crossed the yellow boundary. They worked in measured steps. Tension moved from the trapped tree to the new restraint. The cable settled less than an inch. Walter checked the gauge. Eli checked it independently. Only when both readings matched did Walter approve cutting the section caught around the pine. The tree sprang upright. The remaining line dropped into the temporary cradle without striking the tower. Inside the station, nothing moved. Walter waited 10 minutes before approaching the machinery room door. The county chain opened with a key from the disposal packet. The older audit seal was different. Breaking it carelessly would destroy the record of how the room had been left. Evelyn photographed the seal from every angle and placed a ruler beside the stamped number 14. Ruth, who had arrived with cable clamps and sandwiches, signed a statement as witness. Eli signed beneath her. Walter cut the thin wire behind the stamped plate, leaving the seal intact. The door resisted, then opened against a ridge of rust. Cold grease and old stone gave the room a stale smell. The main drum filled most of the space. Its surface was filmed with corrosion, but the bearing housings had been coated in preservative. Someone had protected the machinery after the rest of the station was abandoned. A faded red line crossed the floor near the drum. Beyond it, a narrow maintenance platform had partly separated from the wall. Walter extended the boundary with fresh chalk. On the lower side of the drum sat a rectangular inspection plate, secured by 8 bolts. 7 showed ordinary corrosion. The 8th had a bright crescent where a wrench had slipped after rust formed. Walter photographed the mark and positioned a camera facing the plate. Evelyn started the recording and read aloud the date, time, names present, and condition of the room. Walter loosened the bolts in a crossing pattern. When the final one came free, the plate remained stuck. He checked the gauge again, placed a wooden shield between the opening and the observers, and used threaded rods to draw the plate outward evenly. A clot of hardened grease broke loose. Something small dropped onto the steel lip inside the housing. It was not a bolt. Walter lifted out a broken piece of machined metal, no larger than 2 fingers laid together. One edge had fractured cleanly. Another had been ground smooth as if someone had tried to remove identifying marks. Beneath the black grease, faint characters remained. Evelyn brought a tray lined with white cloth. Walter placed the fragment on it without wiping the surface. Ruth stared at the piece. "That caused the accident?" "We do not know that," Walter said. "It was inside the break. That tells us where it ended up, not what it did before it broke." He cleaned only the narrow strip where the characters appeared. Slowly, a serial number emerged. Avsedemneist, 4429. Walter wrote it down before speaking again. Eli leaned closer without touching the tray. "That profile is wrong," he said. Walter asked him to explain. "The shoulder is too shallow for a load brake. It looks like a latch from a hoist." "What kind?" "Farm equipment, maybe. A grain lift." Walter measured the fragment with calipers. The dimensions matched neither the station diagram mounted on the wall nor the specifications he remembered from Ridgway's systems. Evelyn examined the metal tag found near the sealed door. Its code began with 14, followed by letters she had assumed meant maintenance. Now she read the last 2 characters differently. "TR," she said. "Transfer record." Walter looked up. Ridgway maintenance orders began with M. Transfer records began with T. This part was moved through shipping, not entered through the repair department. A legitimate brake replacement should have generated an engineering order, inspection certificate, and installation report. A transfer record could move an object between warehouses without identifying how it would be used. Ruth called a supplier in the valley. The serial prefix led to Alder Valley Equipment, a manufacturer of agricultural lifting systems that had closed 19 years earlier. An archived catalog existed at the State Trade Library. While they waited, Eli sat on an overturned bucket. His hands shook slightly now that the work had stopped. Evelyn offered him coffee. He accepted, then admitted he had slept in the utility truck for almost 2 months. A former coworker allowed him to keep it while he searched for work, but the arrangement was ending. Walter glanced toward the lower storage room. "It is dry. It needs a window panel and a smoke detector." Eli stiffened. "I wasn't asking. You help inspect the station. You follow the boundaries and challenge my calculations when they deserve it. In return, you have a place to sleep until you find steady work." Evelyn added, "And we write the agreement down. Clear terms protect everyone." Eli looked from one of them to the other, then nodded. By late afternoon, the trade library emailed a scanned catalog page to Ruth's store. The AV-17 series belonged to a braking latch designed for agricultural lifts, carrying less than 1/5 of Black Ridge's operating load. Walter compared the drawing with the fragment. The bolt holes aligned. The fracture point matched the deepest stress mark. But a farm-grade latch could not have entered an industrial brake assembly by accident. Someone had selected it, installed it, and concealed the transaction outside the maintenance system. Walter looked through the open inspection port. Deep inside the drum, Behind another layer of grease, a narrow strip of metal caught the light. It was painted blue. The broken fragment had not been alone. The next morning, Evelyn wrote Eli's agreement at the old dispatch desk. One page covered the room: meals, work hours, safety rules, and the right of either side to end the arrangement without debt or obligation. Walter added a line requiring every inspection to be recorded. Eli added another stating that he could refuse any task he believed unsafe. They all signed. It was the first document Evelyn filed in a new binder labeled Black Ridge Current. Eli moved into the lower storage room with a mattress Ruth found at the church resale center. He repaired the broken window frame himself, but Walter inspected the wall anchors before allowing him to sleep there. By the second night, a battery lamp glowed beneath the door. The station began to sound different. Not quieter, more human. Boots crossed the lower hall. A kettle rattled on the stove. Evelyn's radio played weather reports in the morning. Walter and Eli argued over measurements, then tested both methods. Ruth arrived without knocking and left with a list of materials longer than the one she had brought. Walter did not teach by giving speeches. He handed Eli a length of retired cable and asked what he noticed. Eli ran a cloth along the strands and found a broken wire hidden beneath grease. "Why did you find it?" Walter asked. "Because the cloth caught. Your eyes confirm. Your hands discover." Later, Eli tapped the bolts of an anchor assembly in sequence. 6 gave a high, clean note. The 7th answered flat. He reached for a wrench. Walter stopped him. "First question, why it sounds different. Second, whether touching it changes the load." Walter nodded. By the end of the week, Eli no longer moved like a man trying to prove he deserved to stay. He moved like someone responsible for the place around him. Evelyn also noticed the station had become a subject of argument in town. Some people called Walter brave. Others called him dangerous. A few accused him of inventing the brake discovery to stop development on the mountain. Instead of answering online, Evelyn posted a notice at Ruth's store inviting residents to a safety walk at Black Ridge. 23 people arrived. Most stayed in the lower yard while Walter explained the colored boundaries and the condition of the remaining structures. He did not display the broken latch. He showed photographs, measurements, and the sealed evidence tray. Eli demonstrated how a damaged line could appear sound from several feet away. Among the visitors was Mara Kent, captain of the volunteer mountain rescue team. She studied the slope below the station and the broad gravel yard. "We've needed a high-angle training site for years," she said. Walter pointed to the red markings. "No one trains here until the tower base is independently certified." Mara smiled. "That is the first sensible answer anyone has given me about this place." That afternoon, Ruth brought folding chairs. Evelyn found an old dining table in the bunkhouse annex, where the floor remained sound. Eli repaired its legs. They ate stew around it with Mara and 2 rescue volunteers while sleet struck the windows. For the first time since losing their home, Walter and Evelyn were not eating from cartons or balancing plates on their knees. The table did not match. Neither did the chairs. No one apologized for either. 2 days later, a gray sedan stopped below the station. The man who stepped out remained beside the car for several minutes. He was broad-shouldered despite his age, with a stiff gait and a cap bearing the faded Ridgeway stone emblem. Walter recognized the emblem before the face. The man introduced himself as Frank Delaney. "I worked this line," he said. They sat at the table. Frank kept both hands around a cup of coffee without drinking. He had been 27 when the Black Ridge accident occurred. 3 men died: Luis Ortega, Ben Mercer, and Thomas Wynn. Frank survived because he had been sent to check a guide wheel moments before the carrier broke loose. The official report said the crew overloaded the carrier and ignored established limits. Frank stared at the grain of the table. That was not what happened. Walter opened the current binder to a blank page. Frank explained that the brake had begun jerking 3 days before the accident. Each time a loaded carrier entered the upper station, the control lever kicked back hard enough to bruise the operator's hand. Luis filed a written warning. Ben refused to run the line until maintenance examined it. The supervisor, Calvin Voss, arrived in person. He said a shipment had to reach the valley before Monday. Frank said, "A hotel contract. Big money." He told us the replacement part had already been installed, and the brake only needed time to seat. Walter asked what replacement part. A crate came up the night before. Narrow wooden box with a blue stripe painted around it. No company stencil. No inspection tag. I helped carry it inside. Frank remembered seeing the discarded packaging near the loading bay the next morning. The shipping paper was folded inward. He noticed the words agricultural lift because his brother owned a grain elevator. He said nothing then. After the accident, company officials kept the surviving workers in the Valley office until after midnight. A lawyer prepared statements saying the crew had loaded an extra stone block without authorization. Frank refused to sign at first. Then Calvin reminded him that his family lived in a company-owned house. His wife was pregnant. Their medical coverage, survivor payment, and housing assistance all depended on cooperation. I signed, Frank said. I told myself I was protecting them. The same word Daniel had used settled heavily over the table. Evelyn asked whether Frank still had a copy. He shook his head. His wife had burned it. She said she could not raise their daughter in a house paid for by that lie. They moved away within a month. Frank had not returned to Black Ridge until that day. Walter brought out the evidence tray but did not uncover the fragment until Frank signed a statement confirming that he understood the item had not yet been officially identified as the cause of the accident. When the white cloth was folded back, Frank leaned forward. Then he pointed to a narrow groove near the broken edge. There, inside the groove, remained a flake of blue paint. Frank's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. That was the color on the crate. His certainty did not prove who installed the part. It did not establish why the latch failed or whether another defect contributed. Walter stated each limitation aloud, and Evelyn wrote them down. Frank looked almost angry. You think I came all this way to make up a paint color? No, Walter said. I think you came because the truth matters. That is why we do not ask it to carry more weight than it can. Frank lowered himself into the chair. For 31 years, he had carried memory as though it were evidence, and guilt as though it were duty. Evelyn asked if Frank would give a recorded statement. He agreed on one condition. The 3 men who died, he said, their names go somewhere people can see them, not just in a file. Eli brought a clean board from the storage room. Frank wrote the names himself. Luis Ortega, Ben Mercer, Thomas Wynn. They placed the board beneath the old dispatch clock. That evening, Eli added another chair to the table without being asked. Black Ridge was still cold. Most of its windows were patched, its upper rooms remained restricted, and the legal threat surrounding the land had not disappeared. But the station was no longer only shelter for 2 people forced from their home. It had become a place where a man sleeping in a truck could use his skill, where a frightened witness could finally speak, and where 3 erased names could be written back into the world. Before turning out the lights, Walter examined the blue paint through a magnifying lens. Beneath it, pressed into the inner groove of the fragment, was a second marking, not a serial number. A warehouse transfer code. 3 days after Frank's visit, Evelyn drove to the Bell County Records Annex with the warehouse transfer code copied onto an index card. The annex occupied the basement of an old municipal building where the air smelled of paper, dust, and radiator heat. A clerk named Nora Bell warned her that Ridgeway Stone records had arrived in fragments after the company dissolved. Some boxes were indexed. Others had handwritten labels and no reliable dates. Evelyn asked for transfer ledgers, supplier invoices, and equipment certificates from the year of the Black Ridge accident. The official maintenance file stated that Black Ridge's primary brake latch had been replaced 14 days before the accident with an approved industrial component. The report included a certification stamp and serial number. RB 94171-6. That number did not match the fragment inside the evidence tray. The warehouse transfer code appeared in a separate ledger beside a shipment entered 1 day before the accident. The description read mechanical assembly, temporary stock transfer. No engineering authorization was attached. The receiving location was 14 Black Ridge. The entry referred to invoice 7714-C. Evelyn found it in the supplier file. It listed an approved industrial brake assembly costing $4,800. Its serial number matched the official report. At first, the paperwork appeared complete. Then she noticed the invoice sequence. The forms before and after it had pale green carbon backs. Invoice 7714-C was printed on white paper from a newer machine. Its margins were narrower, and the company address used a postal abbreviation Ridgeway had not adopted until the following year. Someone had created it later and inserted it into the file. Evelyn asked whether duplicate carbon copies had been stored separately. Purchasing copies went to accounts, Nora said. Warehouse copies sometimes stayed with shipping. The shipping cartons had not been indexed. They opened boxes, marked agricultural accounts, vehicle parts, and miscellaneous transfers. Evelyn did not search for the name Black Ridge. Anyone hiding a transaction would have avoided using it. In a carton labeled North Valley Farm Accounts, she found a carbon sheet folded around a delivery receipt. The invoice number was 7,714 without the letter C. It listed one AV-17 agricultural hoist latch for $286. The serial number was AV-174429, the same number Walter had uncovered beneath the grease. The purchaser was Ridgway Stone and Freight. The delivery destination had first been typed as Central Agricultural Storage, then crossed out and replaced by Warehouse Transfer Code 14. Approval initials appeared at the bottom. Say, V. Evelyn called Walter. I found the original. He did not ask whether she was certain. What makes it original? Correct carbon paper. Continuous sequence. Matching transfer code and serial number. The false copy uses a format that did not exist yet. Only then did Walter ask her to photograph it. Nora arranged certified copies and placed the original in a preservation sleeve. Evelyn requested a statement describing where the invoice had been found. Before leaving, she compared the initials against other Ridgway documents. Calvin Voss had signed dozens of purchase orders as operations director. His initials matched. Back at Black Ridge, Walter laid the two invoices side by side. One described an industrial brake assembly that had never been found. The other described the cheaper latch recovered from the drum. Eli studied the dates. If the approved part existed, where did it go? That is the next question, Walter said. The payment ledger raised another. Ridgway had paid the full industrial price. The agricultural supplier received only $286. The remaining amount had passed through a consulting account controlled by a company that disappeared within a year. Someone had not only substituted a dangerous part, someone had profited from it. Walter prepared a technical summary without claiming the latch alone caused the accident. Evelyn built a document timeline. Frank signed a corrected statement confirming that the crew had reported brake trouble and that a blue-striped crate arrived before the final shift. They sent copies to the county prosecutor, the state workplace safety archive, and an independent mechanical engineer. Evelyn also contacted Lila Grant, a reporter for the Bell County Ledger. Lila expected a family dispute. Walter redirected her. "You may write about our son when the court record is public," he said. "Today, you are here because 3 workers were blamed for their own deaths." Lila reviewed the certified invoices, photographs, and Frank's statement. She asked whether Walter believed Calvin Voss knowingly installed the wrong part. "The records show he approved its purchase," Walter replied. "Intent is for investigators to determine." The article appeared 2 days later. It did not accuse anyone of murder. It asked why Black Ridge's official repair invoice had been created on the wrong paper, why the recovered serial number belonged to agricultural equipment, and why the surviving workers' warning had vanished. For the first time in 31 years, Luis Ortega, Ben Mercer, and Thomas Wynn appeared on the front page without the word negligence beside them. People began driving up the mountain to leave flowers beneath the board Frank had made. Mara Kent's rescue team received permission to use the lower yard for ground exercises while the tower remained restricted. Ruth organized meals for volunteers, improving the second exit. Eli found paid work inspecting radio masts, but continued living at Black Ridge and contributing toward utilities. The station was still unfinished, yet it had become visible. That visibility brought Daniel back into the story. Evelyn found Hale Ridge Construction named as the primary infrastructure contractor for Voss Peak Resort, a luxury development beyond the northern slope. The proposed service road crossed Black Ridge land for nearly half a mile. Without it, the developers would have to build around protected wetlands and unstable rock at enormous cost. Daniel's questions about easements now had a price. The next afternoon, a black SUV climbed the access road. Malcolm Voss stepped out, wearing polished boots, and introduced himself as president of Voss Development. He praised the memorial, the volunteers, and Walter and Evelyn's determination. Then he placed a purchase proposal on the dispatch desk. The offer was 6 times what they had paid. Malcolm said the resort would improve the road and preserve part of the station as local history. Evelyn stopped on the second page. The agreement required them to surrender all machinery, records, photographs, and recovered components connected to Black Ridge. Walter pushed it back. The land may have a price, he said. The truth does not. Malcolm warned that the station was not certified for residential use and that public activity created liability. County inspectors, he said, might not be as patient as he had been. Is that concern? Evelyn asked. Or a threat? That depends on what you call cooperation. After he left, Evelyn reopened the county planning file. Attached to the resort application was an email chain between Voss Development and Hale Ridge Construction. The earliest message had been sent 6 weeks before Daniel filed for temporary control of his parents' finances. Its subject line read, Black Ridge Access Family Resolution. Malcolm Voss did not return to Black Ridge. The county did. 2 mornings after Evelyn found the email chain, 3 vehicles climbed the mountain road. A building inspector's pickup, a county sedan, and Daniel's gray SUV. A woman from Adult Protective Services stepped out first, carrying a tablet and wearing the careful expression of someone prepared to enter a dangerous situation. Daniel came around the vehicle before anyone else could speak. I asked them to come because this has gone too far, he said. Walter looked toward the inspector. Who requested the inspection? The man checked his paperwork. Complaint submitted through Voss Development, supported by your temporary financial guardian. Evelyn wrote the sentence down. Inspector Aaron Pike asked to see the occupied rooms, emergency exits, heating system, and restricted machinery areas. Walter handed him a site map showing the white, yellow, and red zones. You prepared this? Pike asked. I did. Licensed engineer? Retired cable. Systems inspector. Not licensed for residential certification. Walter did not decorate the answer. That honesty did not erase the problems. The rear railing sat below current code. The smoke alarms were not connected to a central system. Their kerosene heater was approved only for temporary use. The upper machinery room lacked a proper barrier, and the eastern hall had no emergency lighting when the generator was disconnected. Daniel followed Pike with visible relief. You see, they cannot stay here. I see violations, Pike replied. I have not ordered an evacuation. Walter requested each deficiency in writing, the exact code section, and the correction period. Pike gave them 10 days. Dana Webb from Protective Services interviewed Walter and Evelyn separately. Walter explained why he bought the property, which areas remained unsafe, and what he would do if the cable restraint failed. He identified the evacuation route and the work he was not qualified to certify himself. Dana asked whether Daniel had advised him not to buy Black Ridge. He ordered me not to, Walter said. Advice allows an answer. Evelyn provided the court order, deed, planning documents, and a copy of the email chain linking Daniel's company to the proposed access road. Dana found no sign that Eli, Ruth, or Frank had manipulated them. She found a family conflict involving money, housing, and disputed authority. Daniel called that conclusion evasive. Dana called it accurate. Before leaving, Pike placed a red correction notice beside the door. It did not condemn the station. It required the listed repairs, or an end to residential use, until they were completed. By afternoon, photographs of the notice had spread through town. Malcolm called once. He offered to send Voss contractors at no cost if Walter surrendered the brake assembly for professional evaluation and signed temporary access across the northern parcel. Evelyn asked whether the evaluator would be independent. Malcolm said Voss would select a qualified firm. The assembly stays where it is, Walter said, until the state appoints someone with no financial interest. Then you may lose the station over a technicality, Malcolm warned. We may lose the right to sleep here until the technicalities are corrected, Evelyn replied. Those are not the same thing. The work began before sunset. Mara Kent brought rescue volunteers to rebuild the railing and widen the escape path. Ruth recorded every donated alarm, screw, and length of conduit. Eli arranged for a licensed electrician to inspect the circuits. Walter assigned tasks, but stepped back whenever someone else held the proper qualification. Evelyn maintained receipts, waivers, and photographs of each repair. The red notice remained on the door as a reminder that some of Daniel's concerns were real, even if his purpose was not. On the third day, a courier delivered a new court filing. Daniel had petitioned to expand his temporary authority over every asset his parents acquired, including Black Ridge. His lawyer argued that buying a hazardous industrial property proved impaired judgment and exposed the couple to exploitation. The petition requested permission to negotiate a sale for the protection of the estate. Attached was a proposed access agreement with Voss Development. It had been drafted 11 days before the inspection. Daniel arrived that evening without his lawyer. He stopped at the new barrier, while volunteers installed emergency lights. "You are making this worse," he said. Walter pointed toward the corrected exit. "That is safer than it was yesterday." "You know what I mean." Evelyn carried the access agreement outside. "When did you first discuss this road with Malcolm?" Daniel glanced at the others. "This is a family matter. You made it a county matter." He asked to speak privately. Walter remained beside Evelyn. Daniel admitted Hale Ridge Construction had signed a conditional infrastructure contract with Voss Peak Resort. He had bought equipment, hired crews, and borrowed against expected payments. Without the road through Black Ridge, the project might be delayed for years. "My company could collapse," he said. Walter's face did not change. "So you needed our land. I needed a solution. You needed our signatures," Evelyn said. "When you thought we might refuse, you tried to become the person allowed to sign for us." Daniel insisted his concerns had begun before the resort deal. The house had stairs. Walter's mistakes were real. Black Ridge contained genuine hazards. "No," Walter said. "You did not invent the facts. You arranged them into the answer you wanted." Daniel looked toward the station. "You are risking everything for 3 dead men you never knew." Frank's board was visible through the open door. Evelyn folded the agreement. "Those men were blamed because powerful people controlled the paperwork. You are using the same method on us." Anger left Daniel's face. What remained was exhaustion. He said Malcolm had promised the access issue would be simple. No one expected his parents to purchase the station. He only wanted enough time to keep the contract from failing. Walter asked whether Daniel knew the old brake records were questionable when he filed the first petition. Daniel hesitated. He admitted Malcolm had mentioned old liability issues and wanted the land cleared quickly. He claimed he never saw the invoices or knew the workers had been falsely blamed. "But you knew there was something here he wanted controlled," Evelyn said. Daniel looked at the red notice instead of his mother. Ruth stepped outside with the electrician's certification. The emergency system now passed. 2 days remained before Pike returned. The railing and second exit were complete. A vented heating unit would be installed the next morning. Only the final gate around the machinery area remained. Daniel turned toward his SUV. "You were right about one thing," Walter said. Daniel stopped. This place needed help. But help is not the same as ownership. After Daniel drove away, Evelyn opened an email from the court clerk. The judge had granted an emergency hearing. It would take place at Black Ridge, where the court could examine both the couple's judgment and the property Daniel claimed proved they had none. The emergency hearing began at Black Ridge under a sky the color of unpolished steel. By 8 that morning, Eli had finished bolting the final safety gate around the machinery level. Aaron Pike inspected the new railing, tested the alarms, checked the vented heater, and signed the correction sheet. The red notice came down from the door. Walter did not celebrate. Passing a building inspection proved only that the occupied rooms met the required standard. It did not answer what had happened inside the brake drum, or whether Daniel still had the right to decide what his parents could own. County Judge Ellen Marlowe arrived with a clerk, 2 attorneys, and Dr. Lena Ortiz, the independent mechanical engineer appointed to examine the evidence. Dana Webb from Adult Protective Services attended, as did the state evaluator who had interviewed Walter and Evelyn the previous day. Malcolm Voss came with counsel. Daniel stood apart from him. Families of Luis Ortega, Ben Mercer, and Thomas Wynn gathered near the names written beneath the dispatch clock. Judge Marlowe opened the hearing in the lower hall because the dispute involved both the condition of the property and the couple's ability to understand its risks. She warned everyone that the court was not conducting a criminal trial. Its immediate questions were narrower: whether Walter and Evelyn remained capable of managing their affairs, whether Daniel's temporary authority should continue, and whether Black Ridge had been acquired or maintained through impaired judgment. Dr. Ortiz began at the machinery room. Evelyn presented the photographs, witness statements, measurement logs, and video showing the audit seal before it was cut. Ruth and Eli confirmed that the seal and inspection plate had been documented before anyone entered the housing. Dr. Ortiz examined the temporary restraint, the recovered fragment, and the interior of the drum. She asked Walter to explain each step he had taken. He did not recite his career. He described the load path, the trapped cable, the second anchor, the independent readings, and the reason he had refused to open the housing until the remaining force had been transferred. When Dr. Ortiz questioned one estimate, Walter pointed to Eli's correction in the notebook. "You preserved a disagreement?" she asked. "I preserved the calculation we actually used." Dr. Ortiz nodded and continued. Using a flexible camera, she inspected the space behind the lower gear assembly. The strip of blue-painted metal still visible inside was not another broken latch. It was a bent inventory tag lodged beneath a retaining plate. The tag carried the same warehouse transfer code Evelyn had traced at the county annex. Dr. Ortiz removed it in view of the clerk and placed it beside the recovered fragment. The blue paint matched the flake trapped in the groove. She then compared the fragment's serial number with the certified carbon invoice. Av17 4420. The numbers matched digit for digit. Her fracture analysis showed that the latch had failed along a stress line consistent with repeated loads far above its design rating. Wear marks indicated it had operated inside the Black Ridge brake assembly, not merely been stored there. The mounting holes had been enlarged by hand to fit equipment for which the part had never been designed. Malcolm's attorney asked whether Dr. Ortiz could swear the latch alone caused the carrier to break free. "No," she said, "the full system no longer exists, but this component was unsuitable, modified for installation, and capable of producing the loss of braking described in the surviving records." She added that the official industrial part listed on invoice 7714C had left no physical trace at the station. Evelyn testified next. She placed the two invoices on the dispatch table without dramatizing them. She explained the carbon sequence, the later postal abbreviation, the altered destination, and the transfer code hidden among agricultural accounts. Nora Bell's certified statement established where the original had been found. The false invoice claimed Ridgway purchased a brake assembly for $4,800. The authentic invoice documented a $286 agricultural latch. Payment records showed that most of the difference had moved into a consulting account linked to Calvin Voss. Malcolm said his father had been dead for 9 years and could not answer accusations. Evelyn replied, "That is why records matter. They cannot apologize, but they also cannot be pressured into changing their memory." Frank Delaney approached the table with his corrected statement. His voice faltered when he named the 3 men who had reported the jerking brake. It steadied when he described Calvin Voss ordering the crew to complete the shipment. He admitted signing the false overload account after company representatives threatened his family's housing and medical support. Daniel's attorney argued that a confession made 31 years later could not prove Walter and Evelyn were competent today. Judge Marlowe agreed that it could not. "That question will be answered by the evaluator," she said. "Mr. Delaney's testimony concerns why this property may have held evidence worth preserving." The state evaluator, Dr. Samuel Price, summarized separate examinations of both spouses. Evelyn showed no clinically significant cognitive impairment. Walter displayed mild, age-related memory decline. He sometimes needed additional time to recall recent details and benefited from written schedules. Daniel looked toward his lawyer. Dr. Price continued. Walter understood the purchase price, remaining funds, code violations, injury risks, pending litigation, and the possibility that no criminal charge would result from the evidence. He had delegated electrical certification, accepted corrected calculations, marked inaccessible areas, and documented decisions whose consequences he could explain. "Forgetting a word," Dr. Price said, "is not the same as forgetting what a contract does." He concluded that Walter retained decision-making capacity. Dana Webb then presented the email chain. 6 weeks before Daniel sought temporary financial control, Hale Ridge Construction and Voss Development had discussed obtaining Black Ridge access through a family resolution. 11 days before the county inspection, Daniel had received a draft agreement allowing him to sell or grant an easement if his authority expanded. Daniel rose before his attorney could stop him. He said he had believed the resort would save his company and secure jobs for 32 workers. He had also believed his parents were becoming vulnerable. Both things, he insisted, could be true. Walter answered from his chair. They can. But you used one truth to hide what you were doing with the other. Daniel admitted he knew Malcolm wanted the property cleared quickly. He denied knowing about the substituted latch or the false invoice. Malcolm's attorney objected to any suggestion that his client had directed the guardianship petition. Judge Marlowe noted that criminal responsibility was not before her and returned to the financial conflict. Her ruling came after a short recess. Daniel's temporary authority was terminated immediately. He was ordered to provide a full accounting of every transfer, listing expense, removed item, and contract involving his parents' property. No sale of their former home could proceed until the court reviewed whether he had exceeded the original order. The petition to control Black Ridge was denied. The judge also directed the clerk to send the technical report, invoices, and witness statement to the State Workplace Safety Division and county prosecutor for independent review. She did not declare anyone guilty of the old deaths. She declared that there was enough credible evidence to investigate them again. Outside the station, relatives of the three workers touched the board bearing their names. Frank stood several feet away until Luis Ortega's daughter crossed the yard and took his hand. Daniel remained inside. He placed 2 old brass house keys on the dispatch table. The locks they belonged to had already been changed, but Evelyn recognized the worn red thread she had tied around 1 year earlier. I thought I was preventing a disaster, Daniel said. You were preventing us from stopping yours, she replied. He apologized. Not for the court, not for the contract. For making their age sound like a vacancy he was entitled to fill. Walter closed his notebook. The mistake was not believing we might need help, he said. The mistake was deciding that help made you our owner. Daniel asked whether there was anything he could do. Evelyn picked up the keys but did not give him one. There may be, she said, but an apology opens a conversation. It does not restore trust. Beyond the window, the old cable no longer pulled against the tower. For the first time since Walter and Evelyn arrived, the machinery room held no hidden tension. The family did. The investigation into Black Ridge continued for months. But Walter and Evelyn no longer allowed the case to decide the shape of their days. The first matter they settled was the house. The court's accounting showed that Daniel had listed the property, removed furniture, and paid preliminary sales expenses without authority to complete the transaction. The listing was withdrawn. The locks were changed again, this time under Walter and Evelyn's direction, and every item taken into storage was returned or documented. They could have moved back. Instead, they stood in the kitchen one quiet afternoon and looked at the marks on the doorway where Daniel's height had been measured. Evelyn touched the highest line with one finger. Walter opened the cabinet where his old inspection notebooks had once been kept. The house still belonged to them. Their life no longer did. They sold it 6 months later, after choosing the buyer themselves. A young family promised to keep the lilacs along the fence. Walter left the porch plans in a labeled envelope, and Evelyn removed the red thread from the final house key before handing it over. Part of the money restored Black Ridge. Part paid legal costs. The rest established the Hale Independence Fund, which provided small grants for older residents facing coercive guardianship, emergency housing loss, or pressure to sign documents they did not understand. Evelyn insisted the fund also pay for independent evaluations. Protection should never depend on the person who wants control choosing the expert, she said. Black Ridge changed without losing its scars. The lower station became the Hale Mountain Safety and Rescue Center. The dispatch office served as a classroom. The former break room became an emergency shelter during blizzards. The machinery room remained preserved behind a certified barrier with the recovered latch, the 2 invoices, and the names of Luis Ortega, Ben Mercer, and Thomas Wynn displayed together. No plaque called Walter a hero. He refused one. The memorial explained that 3 workers had reported danger, that their warnings were ignored, and that the truth returned because records, skill, and testimony were finally allowed to stand beside one another. Mara Kent's volunteers trained there twice a month. Eli completed additional certification and became the center's technical coordinator. He moved from the storage room into a small apartment in town, but kept a key to Black Ridge and arrived early for every inspection. Frank spoke only a few times each year. He never described himself as brave. He told younger workers that fear could explain silence without making silence harmless. Ruth took control of the kitchen during storms. She labeled shelves in handwriting large enough for anyone to read and kept coffee ready for stranded drivers, rescue crews, and people who needed somewhere warm before they knew what came next. Walter taught cable inspection at a slower pace than he once worked. His knees required a chair between demonstrations. He used written schedules and let Eli handle the highest structures. None of that embarrassed him anymore. He had spent years believing independence meant never needing assistance. Black Ridge taught him that independence meant choosing the assistance, understanding its limits, and remaining part of every decision. Evelyn taught a different class at the long table. She showed people how to keep copies of deeds, medical directives, account lists, and powers of attorney. She told them to write down who had access to what, and to ask why any document described as temporary contained language that could outlive the emergency. The state investigation eventually confirmed financial fraud and deliberate falsification of safety records at Ridgway Stone. Calvin Voss had been beyond prosecution, but the consulting transfers and altered files were formally documented. The official cause record was amended. The 3 dead workers were cleared of negligence. Malcolm Voss was not charged with causing the old accident. His resort permits, however, were suspended during a broader review, and the access route through Black Ridge was removed from the final plan. Voss Development paid into a worker safety restitution fund without receiving the machinery, records, or land it had tried to control. Daniel's consequences were more personal. He sold 2 company vehicles and his vacation property to repay the money spent from his parents' accounts. He withdrew Hale Ridge Construction from the Voss project and provided investigators with emails his attorney advised him to keep private. The company survived, smaller than before. For 4 months, Daniel did not visit Black Ridge. He sent monthly accounting statements, proof of repayment, and short letters that asked for nothing. Evelyn filed them. Walter read them once. The first time Daniel returned, he stopped outside the lower gate. He had brought work gloves, a level, and replacement boards for the weathered fence. "I am not asking to come inside," he said. "Ruth told me the west fence needs repair." Walter looked at Evelyn. She did not nod. She did not refuse. She simply opened the tool shed and placed a box of screws on the ground outside the gate. Daniel worked alone until dusk. He returned the following Saturday and the one after that. He repaired the fence, replaced a warped step, and submitted receipts for every purchase. He never mentioned forgiveness. Weeks later, Evelyn invited him to eat at the long table after a rescue drill. He sat near the end, beside volunteers who knew exactly what he had done. No one pretended the past had disappeared. When Daniel left, he still did not receive a key. The following spring, Walter stood in the training yard with a group of new rescue volunteers. Between 2 anchors, they were preparing a practice safety line. A young man pulled the rope until it sang. Walter raised his hand. "Too tight," he said. The volunteer loosened it too far. "Now it will not carry anyone." Walter stepped forward and adjusted the tension with both hands. "A line has to hold weight without becoming a prison," he said. "That is true of more than rope." Across the yard, Daniel paused beside the repaired fence. Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching him without inviting him closer and without turning away. The line settled into place. Behind them, the old station lamp came on above the entrance. Below it, the door remained open for travelers caught on the mountain after dark. Black Ridge had once carried stone. Then it carried a lie for 31 years. Now it carried people home.